Hi, everyone. My name is Brenna Bell. I am BARC's policy coordinator, staff attorney, and fire aficionado. I love talking about fire, and I'm excited that you are all here today with us to talk about the Riverside Fire and the larger context of fire ecology in which it resides. And if you are new to BARC, introduce the organization just a little bit before we get started. BARC focuses on land management and culture change in Mountain Hood National Forest. In other times, we do a lot of hikes and campouts. We've actually been able to do a fair amount of that even in the coronavirus times, doing them on a very limited but safe scale. We advocate, agitate, and educate around federal land policy with a real eye to shifting the way culture views the ecologies to where we're much more of a woven part of it rather than extracting from it. We're really glad you're here tonight to share this time talking about fire. The main flow of the evening is I am going to be setting up the context for the Riverside Fire, talking about fire ecology and management from basically colonization to the era of climate change. And then Michael will be talking more specifically about Riverside Fire itself, what happened, how it impacted the land, and what happens next. And then I'm going to be taking it back from some more big picture things around fire policy and where do we go from here in this era of fire and climate change. Throughout the evening, we invite your questions. We invite you to type them into the chat, and Michael and I will be kind of watching it while the other one is presenting. And if there are issues that haven't been resolved, we'll definitely have time at the end of the event to go over your questions. And before we get started, if you've been coming to BARC events, you know that we are doing a land acknowledgement practice before every event. And this is going to take about 5 minutes where we can step back and think about whose land we are on and what our relationship to it is. So I'm going to read the land acknowledgement statement and then lead us in a practice of action around land acknowledgement. As an organization founded by white people in the lineage of settler colonial environmentalism, BARC understands that our work has been inherently within and empowered by the white supremacist legacy of land theft and the erasure of Native authority over stolen lands, referred to now as the public lands of Mount Hood National Forest. As an advocacy organization, BARC maintains relationships with the agencies of the U.S. federal government, which originally implemented the violence, land theft, colonization, and displacement of Indigenous people, including through the creation of public lands, and which has not corrected these actions. All non-Native people have privilege to access this land as a direct result of this legacy of violence and injustice. BARC's current staff, board of directors, and volunteers are working to transform the organization to first of all acknowledge all our implicit participation in the ongoing displacement of Native people by something that unfortunately is blocked by my screen. I would say it's ongoing white supremacy and colonization. And next, we're going to move into a land acknowledgement practice, because it's not enough just to say we recognize that we are standing on stolen land. We need to think about how we transform our relationship with it. And so we begin this practice of acknowledgement and respect by personally dedicating time, energy, and action to support the Molalla, the Kalapuya, Chinook, Clackamas, Wasco, Wishram, and Northern Paiute people who have lived here and always have lived here, and the many other Native nations who've always been part of and cared for the land that we now occupy. At this moment, if there are any Indigenous people on this Zoom call, we invite you to take a moment and speak about about anything that you want that's brought up by this land acknowledgement and practice. And now, for all the non-Native people here tonight, I ask you to take the next 2 to 3 minutes to write some instructions, intentions, actions, and next steps for yourselves. If you have been on a bark event anytime within the past year, you probably are familiar with this practice and are likely even to have a notebook that you've been writing these things in. So we invite you to grab your notebook, and if you haven't done it yet, grab a paper, grab a notebook that you want to start doing this practice in. We're going to need something to write with and something to write on. And now I invite you to take the next 2 to 3 minutes to write instructions, intentions, actions, next step for yourselves about how you will develop your own practice of acknowledgement through action. So if you've been, like I said, if you've been at a recent bark event, you might have these, and I invite you to go back, look over what you have written, evaluate whether or not you're doing these. And if you are new to this, really think through what it means to take a land acknowledgement from theory into practice. We're going to take a couple moments and reflect on that. All right, thanks everybody. And now please set aside your paper for now. Definitely return to it on your own if you feel called, and turn attention away from yourself. And join me in a moment of respectful silence and contemplation and humility in honor of the original people here tonight, across this continent, in the past, the present, and the future. Let's have a moment of gratitude and recognition. Thanks everyone for supporting this important practice of learning. And we invite you to continue this practice and practice that acknowledgement through action on your own time in all the areas of your life, and let us know what you are learning and what is changing as you do it. And we hope that this practice has oriented you to our work for tonight's event. And in this context, when we're talking about ecology, when we're talking about the shape of the land, this is not just theory. The indigenous people of Oregon shaped the way that this land existed. And a lot of it was through their intentional burning. Most people don't really know that, or are starting to learn that when white settlers came to Oregon, the land had already been under intense cultivation for thousands of years. My ancestors came over on the Oregon Trail, and they thought they found an untrammeled wilderness because they couldn't see the type of cultivation that had happened with the use of fire. In the Willamette Valley, the Rogue Valley, the Umpqua Valley, annual burning shifted the nature of the land to allow for the oaks that provided a lot of food and many other important cultural plants. Up in the mountains, the intentional burning cleared the huckleberry fields, created the bear grass that people used for weaving. This land was a land of fire from time immemorial. And that changed when, any of you who've come to my forest policy class know that we talk a lot about that transition from the land from native title, from sovereign nations, to the land theft that came because of the Oregon Donation Land Claims Act, how the US government took that land for itself, giving it away to bona fide white settlers. And what they did massively changed the shape of the land, as well as the people who were on it. Because one of the primary things they stopped, the colonial government stopped, was the practice of intentional fire. And so the landscape that went from having very regular, very intentional fire, as well as, of course, the occasional lightning strikes and large fires that were weather-driven events, went to a landscape that was primarily managed by the US government, and specifically the Forest Service. Right? And you all know this guy. You all know Smokey and what he told people about fire, right? Smokey said, only you can prevent forest fire. It was part of the federal government's massive public education campaign to try and prevent fires from burning on national forests. And by this time, because of the major shift in land management, the Forest Service is the major land manager in Oregon, right? So their decisions affected a lot of land. The Forest Service had two things, both of which are still kind of in play today. One was called the 10 a.m. policy, in which every fire was supposed to be put out by 10 a.m. the next day. And two was, the full suppression policy, you could also call it. And two was this massive public education campaign to get people to be afraid of fire, to think that the fire was bad for the forests. In truth, as we'll continue to talk about, fire was bad for the timber industry, who are a main driver behind the Forest Service's management, but not necessarily for the land itself. So the Forest Service did a campaign to prevent fire and a campaign to put out all fires. And for a while, this was actually working because the weather, it complied with the Forest Service's desires. If you look here, I love this graph. It shows something called the Pacific Decadal Oscillation, these major climatic shifts in the weather systems in the Pacific, right? So you'll go to the beginning of this graph, starts in about 1910, and we were in this warm, dry climactic period. That was about the period where the Dust Bowl was happening, where there was drought throughout the West and the Midwest. And during that time, as you can see, there were a lot of fires, like around between 1910 and 1920, there were huge fires, these big burns that really, really scared the new transplants who came from the East. And they started getting afraid of fire, but didn't really have the tools to stop it. Well, fast forward to the 1940s, and we enter into this cool climactic period. And that directly coincides with people coming home from World War II with a lot of military gear and a lot of trained fighters, and which also coincides with this big boom in a demand for timber and wood. So it gets a lot cooler. We militarize our approach to putting out fires, and the Forest Service just starts pumping out timber sales after timber sales after timber sales. And we got it into our heads that this is what normal looked like, right? That we actually could put out fires because during this time, the weather was cool and moist, and we could, because the fires just had a very different climactic setting. But then we get to 1985, and all of a sudden we move into a warmer, drier period. And it's a warmer, drier period that might just keep getting warmer and drier because of global climate change. And once again, fires are increasing. None of this has to do with whether or not we're good at putting out fires militarily. It has everything to do with what are the underlying weather conditions that are driving the fires. And we're going to get back, we're going to just stick on weather because it is the main thing that we want to talk about. So there are three main factors. This is totally oversimplifying it, but there are three main factors that influence fire behavior. One is it's got to start somehow, right? So how does your fire start? Two, it has to have fuel, and a question like, how big is your fuel? How dry is your fuel? I mean, I hope everyone on this call has tried to start a fire at some point. And if you've ever tried to start a fire with big, wet wood, you've had a really hard time, right? What we do is we want it to be small and want it to be dry. And the fuel, how dry it is the number one characteristic for fuel, lets us know whether or not we're going to have a big fire on our hands. So we've got our ignition source, we've got our type, we've got the climate's slightly different than weather, right? We've got the big picture climate, but then we have the day-to-day weather that also affects the fire's behavior. So I want to talk a little bit about ignition. A lot of you are probably wondering, well, Brenna, we're supposed to talk about the Riverside Fire. When are you going to talk about that? Well, I'll tell you about the Riverside ignition. As far as we know, the Riverside Fire was started by an illegal campfire in the Riverside campground. However, I wouldn't put all the blame on that one individual, because while Riverside was starting up and down the whole West, all of the Cascades, and internal and Southwest Oregon especially, fires were starting. One main thing starting the fires, the Great Labor Day Fire event, were power lines, actually. And so it's very likely that might have, and they also might have contributed to it. If you go a little bit north, the power grid up around Highway 26 was actually turned off in the Labor Day fires, which probably saved the towns of Welch's and Rhododendron and Government Camp. All of those corridor were depowered, but their homes are still standing. If you go south into the Santiam Canyon, they decided not to turn off the power grid. And there were at least 13 different fire starts because of utility poles. So one of the questions we're looking at and going forward is, what are the starts and how do we decrease their likelihood, right? But like I said, you might have an ignition source, but if your fuel is not ready to spark and catch it, your fire is going to go nowhere. There are lots of half-acre, acre fires in the Mount Hood National Forest every year that just fizzle out on their own because they have a lightning strike in this upper area where you have your big wet wood, rather than striking down here in a fuels reduction treatment area where you have a lot of slash debris. So we'll get back to this when we talk about whether or not logging for fire management works. But again, like I said, the main thing that really affects fire behavior is how dry your fuels are, which brings us to climate, right? Like this is truly the main driver of all fire behavior, is what's going on climatically. And remember how I was talking about dry fuels? Well, the reason we're having so many fires, and the main reason that climate change is making our fires worse, is because it's lengthening the fire season by keeping our fuels drier for longer. And every year that we're in drought, and it's pretty much every year now, the fuels have less time to re-moisten during the winter. And so with each successive year of drought, they're drier and drier and drier, right? And we are in a time, this is Oregon right before the Labor Day fires, right? You can see that there is a lot of extreme drought, severe drought, and moderate drought, right? The entire Cascade area that we live in, Mount Hood, was in severe drought. Down in Southern Oregon, where Phoenix and Talent burned, they were experiencing extreme drought, which means everything is a tinderbox just waiting to go. But even that, honestly, wouldn't be so bad if we did not have the last factor, if you all remember, was wind, right? Back to the analogy of making your own fire. When you're having a hard time getting your fire going, what do? You blow on it, or wave a piece of cardboard really fast, try and get the oxygen moving. And that's exactly what we had. It was the perfect firestorm. We were in severe to extreme drought and then had warm east winds, and every major fire event that is known in Western Oregon is attributed to the exact same kind of major warm east wind event that happened. That was what happened in the Tillamook burn. That's what happened in the Yakult burn. This isn't unprecedented. It's unusual, but it's known to happen. And so I wanted to bring you through that. Oh, I'll say one more thing about wind, because people often wonder, well, does climate change have anything to do with the wind event, right? We know that climate change is making the fire season longer by making the fuels drier, right? But what about the wind? And I'm no expert on this, but I did poke around into theories about the Gulf Stream and how climate change is actually affecting the Gulf Stream, which is like this huge atmospheric river of air that makes all of our major climate patterns. And one of the things that's happening is it's getting more jagged because of the climate, rapidly changing climate. And when it gets jagged, extreme events happen. So no one has been able to say this wind event is specifically because of anthropogenic climate change, right? They've happened before. The worry is, though, that they will happen more frequently as the jet stream gets more jagged. So, we're all still figuring this out. These are patterns that are not, like I said, they're not unprecedented, but our worry, of course, is that we're going to have more and more and more of them as things keep drying and the weather patterns keep getting more unstable. So I wanted to give you all that to give you a context to what it was like to, have an ecosystem that had regular tended fire and then a massive time of fire exclusion. And now, because of the fire exclusion and the climatic changes, fire is back with, dare I say, a vengeance and is not going anywhere. So that's the context in which the Riverside Fire happened. And I'm teeing up for Michael now to tell you exactly what happened on the ground with Riverside. So, Michael, going to you if you want to share your screen.
Thanks for that, Brenna. Again, my name is Michael Krochta, and I'm BARC's Forest Watch Coordinator. And I am going to now talk a little bit specifically about what happened with the Riverside Fire, what sort of the immediate effects were, and then some implications that we're going to see moving forward. And to start things off, this is a photo. It's probably one of the most seen photos of the Riverside Fire, which shows these 10,000-foot smoke plumes that were visible on the first day of the fire, within the first 24 hours, on September 8th. And this was a photo that was taken up at Ladie Flat in the Clackamas drainage. And the dead trees here are actually from the 36 pit fire, which burned in 2014. Although the fire did actually eventually reach this area and burn several hundred acres of this area a second time. Brenna talked a little bit about the conditions that were leading up to the Labor Day fires, as these 4 fires that are shown on this map here have been sort of collectively called. And it's often been said that this event was unusual but not unprecedented, and that's really true. These strong winds that we had this year, those are kind of Oregon's version of the dry downslope Santa Ana winds that California gets that really stoke those big fires down there. Although that type of wind event happens in Oregon much less frequently than it does down in California. But it was similar conditions to these that were a really prime factor in some of the most kind of infamous fast-running West Side fires in Oregon history. Some examples are the 1902 fires that Brenna mentioned. Those burned about 1 million acres in Western Oregon. The Tillamook fires, which happened in 1933, that initially was burning around 40,000 acres over 10 days, and then it spread to an additional around 200,000 acres within 20 hours when the winds really picked up from the east. And so, although these fires aren't necessarily unprecedented, they are consistent with what we might expect to see more often with climate change. And this slide just shows some more historic examples in their acreage. Up in Washington in the 1700s, I didn't realize this, but there was on the Olympic Peninsula, which we typically think of as very moist and coastal rainforest, burned 1 million acres, and around that same time there was 3 to 10 million acres in western Washington that burned. We already mentioned the Yakult complex in 1902, 1 million acres, the Tillamook burn, and all of these were stoked by those same east winds late in the summer. And events like this I've heard be called wind events with fire. This is a slide that shows a chart that was put together by the Oregon Department of Forestry. Just shows the largest fires on record since 1900. And Riverside didn't quite make this list. So the Riverside Fire was 138 acres. This Holiday Farm Fire, which is in red along with the Beachy Creek and the Lion's Head fires, which also burned in 2020. That Holiday Farm Fire burned 173,000 acres about. This Long Draw Fire, folks see this on the bottom, is it's the largest since 1900. and that was, let's see, 557,000 acres. That said, there was another fire, the Silverton Fire, which actually I believe holds the record. That was in 1965, and that burned over a million acres. But, significantly this year in the Oregon Cascades, there was 850,000 acres that burned late summer 2020. And on Mount Hood National Forest, there was about 110,000 acres, that's about 10% of the entire national forest. Talking about Riverside Fire here, this is the September 9th map of the Riverside Fire perimeter, so a day after it started. This is the first map that many folks saw on September 9th. That red diamond down there, that shows where the fire was started, like Brenna mentioned, at the Riverside campground by an escaped campfire. And, while many of the other Labor Day fires were already burning, like the Beachy Creek Fire, Lion's Head Fire, when these winds picked up, it's important to note that the Riverside Fire, it wasn't. And this was ignited basically at the same time that these winds picked up, and there was really no warning or preparation for it. This is a fire progression map that shows the growth of that fire over about a week. And I don't know if folks can see those colors all that well, but those two shades of blue there show the September 8th and the September 9th growth. So those first 2 days. And so you can really see, the vast majority of this fire burned within those 2 days of really strong winds that we had. That first day on September 8th, the day of the fire ignition, there was an evacuation of the forest, and it was deemed unsafe to try to suppress the fire on the national forest. And so there wasn't even a chance to try to set up any containment lines or anything like that before it completely burned off the forest. It traveled 17 miles along the Clackamas River drainage within 1 day. And so just like other fires in the region, the Riverside Fire burned at a mixed severity. That said, there was a very large portion of acres that were burned that had tree mortalities as a result of that fast-moving, wind-driven event. And so approximately 44% of the Riverside Fire experienced over 75% of tree mortality occurring. And so this is that reddish color that you can see on this map here. So really, due to these high winds, the fire really did seem to burn very severely or really not much at all, with less in between compared to what we've seen in past fires on the Clackamas. And really, topography seemed to be playing the biggest role here. You can see here these east-west aspects of these steep drainages. They really got hit hard. In this case, what the data is showing is that fuels, they didn't really seem to play as much of a factor here as with other fires. There was really significant amounts of both old growth and plantations that ended up burning pretty severely here. This is just an image looking at the Clackamas drainage, just so we can see some examples here of how experts gauge tree mortality that goes into the map that we previously saw. We have some trees here that have all the needles burnt off, some trees that have been killed but still have some of their needles, and then some in between where the fire may have killed some, but not all the trees. And another way to think about fire severity is the soil burn severity. And this is a map that is from the Forest Service Burned Area Emergency Response Effort. And basically this was created by looking at satellite imagery before and after the fire, and then calculating that change in reflectivity on the ground. And then they go out and they verify this soil burn severity out in the field afterwards. And this BEAR effort, as it's often called, actually pretty important in that it identifies emergency threats to critical values like human life, and it provides recommendations for emergency funding after the fire is out. And I just put some of these definitions, enlarge these definitions a little bit here of what the different soil burn severities are. So generally speaking, you know, if you're looking at a moderate to high soil burn severity, you could expect basically all of the trees in the stand to be killed. Low severity basically means that, you know, the mortality, you're going to expect it to be more variable, but the canopy is probably still going to be intact. And here we have some of the breakdown of the soil burn severity here. So, you know, we have unburned at 13%, high severity 12%, moderate 40%, low is 35%. And looking at that, how that kind of translates spatially over the different subwatersheds. This is sort of showing those subwatersheds of the Clackamas and their soil burn severities here. So you can see that, you know, Fish Creek and the South Fork Clackamas River here were really hit hard in terms of, you know, the percentage of high and moderate soil burn severity. And this is, you know, this is pretty significant since these subwatersheds, they do really contain a lot of important values, and including several species of listed fish. So, you know, the Clackamas River has species of endangered Chinook, coho, and steelhead. And those coho, that coho salmon population that the Clackamas has is really significant since it's one of the last late wild run coho stock remaining in the whole entire Columbia River Basin. And like we saw in some of those previous slides, you know, Fish Creek and the South Fork Clackamas River and the main stem Clackamas River below Fish Creek, those are going to be especially susceptible to increased flows, just, you know, due to that reduction in the canopy and, you know, some of that impacts to soils. There's going to be some landslides and debris flows for several years that are probably going to be heightened due to that high amount of the moderate and soil burn severity in those drainages. And, you know, over the short term, that'll likely fill pools and other habitats that are required for juvenile fish. And over the short term also, you know, stream temperatures will probably increase a bit in some of the tributaries to Fish Creek and the South Fork where that stream side vegetation is burned. That said, all that mortality of the trees in the riparian zones, that's going to also really significantly increase the large woody debris to those streams, and, you know, going to greatly increase the habitat complexity in many areas, which is that's a really good thing for fish. This is looking down the Fish Creek drainage. You know, like we saw in some of those maps and figures, it's the most impacted subwatershed in the Clackamas, and so you can really see here the impact of those high severity fire areas in terms of the tree mortality there. But then you look north across the Clackamas drainage a little bit. This is sort of, let's see, I guess that is the east aspect of the Roaring River watershed. And you see much more of a mixed severity in terms of the tree mortality. This is an image that was taken before the fire, looking across the Clackamas Canyon, southeast across the Clackamas from the Dry Ridge Trail and the Roaring River Wilderness. And this is from that same spot taken afterwards. So, you know, a lot of these areas are going to see a lot of change. It's going to be a lot to get used to in the short term. Some more images here. A lot of folks are familiar with the Ripplebrook store that's along the Highway 224, right before it turns into Highway 46. And folks can see the building next to, this is the Ripplebrook store here. So it did not burn. The building next to it did. This was actually the old district ranger office. And there was actually a lot of buildings that are pretty deep in the Clackamas, a lot of Forest Service housing and PGE infrastructure. And amazingly, many, if not most, of the buildings they're deep into the Clackamas actually survived. So areas up in the Three Links area, the Timberlake Job Corps. So a lot of people get really excited about, seeing ferns and flowers resprouting from burned areas, which is really cool. But I also get really excited about this. This is this orange coating, if folks can see it on the ground here. This is actually a fungal bloom. It's a fungus called Pyronema, and it's prompted by the flush of nutrients that come about after the fire, and it plays a really important role. These fungi bind soil particles together and prevent a good amount of erosion from happening post-fire. And this is the kind of natural recovery that already started occurring within weeks of the fire being out, especially in some of those areas of the low to moderate soil burn severity. This is a photo that was taken right on the edge of the National Forest boundary, which is shared with a lot of private industrial land. This is kind of looking across from the South Fork of the Clackamas towards the North Fork, which, like I mentioned earlier, had already burned once in the 2014 36-pit fire. This is that area kind of across the Clackamas drainage here. And backing out of the forest a little bit onto the industrial forest land, kind of that western flank of the fire. This is all Weyerhaeuser land here that's kind of northeast of the Molalla River, and you can really see how that fire, it really followed and burned right through all of these recent clear cuts. You can see the road scars through all of these, and it didn't differentiate all that much. This is also on private land, something that's becoming kind of a sad but common sight, where there's structures like this one that burned with green trees kind of surrounding it. And when I see stuff like this, it really demonstrates to me the importance of reducing the ignitability of homes themselves within that wildland-urban interface. Since, fires like this often grow through ember casts, which end up landing on or inside homes. This is the Dry Ridge Trail again. And we got a table here showing the breakdown of the 33 miles of designated trail within the Riverside Fire that was affected. So, there's going to be a lot of work to be done before these trails can reopen. And, just for some perspective, this is a map of the 2017 Eagle Creek Fire, which shows in red here all the trails and campgrounds that are still closed, over 3 years later. And so, in comparison, Riverside Fire's much larger fire, almost 3 times as large. And I think it's probably going to be a while until some of these trails are reopened. And that's a lot to get used to, but this is one of my favorite trails right here. This is the Clackamas River Trail that burned in the early 2000s. A few years after, it was already regenerating, and it's really a pretty beautiful trail now. Lots of plant diversity, and so we've also got this to look forward to as well. On the left here, we have a list of all of the designated recreation sites within the Riverside Fire on the National Forests that were affected and are currently all closed. And so, some of these right now are being treated kind of like hazmat sites, just due to the chemicals that are on site or the human waste. Like in this case, we have the Big Eddy Deus area that, it burns the top off of a pit toilet here right next to the river. So, there's, again, a lot of work that needs to be done before these can reopen, including, things like pumping out and capping some of these toilets and rebuilding the infrastructure. And yeah, speaking of that, this is kind of an arc showing the Forest Service process for post-fire planning and action. And so, you know, after the fire and the initial suppression of the fire up here, typically what the agency moves into is the suppression rehabilitation, which, you know, includes things like repairing bulldozer lines and you know, any ecological damage that was a direct result of the fire suppression itself, which we'll talk a little bit more about. This BEAR effort we already talked a bit about earlier, that's again the Burned Area Emergency Response. Right now we're in this RAT stage, so that stands for Rapid Assessment Teams. And those teams right now are looking at some of the more long-term impacts in response and kind of feeding those recommendations into this post-fire restoration implementation and potential salvage, quote unquote, logging. Thankfully, from what we've heard, there's not going to be too much kind of standalone post-fire salvage logging, although we are much more likely to see a pretty large amount of roadside, quote unquote, hazard or danger tree removal within the next year or two. Some of the other things that we're likely to see happen on the ground before anything else are, you know, some road repairs. There will be some rehabilitation of trails and recreation sites, like I mentioned. There's going to be a lot of reassessment of the existing projects the Forest Service has for their effects and viability. So, for example, whether a timber sale is going to have more of a relative effect on northern spotted owls, given that their habitat was, you know, altered by the fire in some places. There'll likely be some invasive plant treatment that occurs, maybe some revegetation in some of the riparian or unstable areas. Some debris slide cleanup is kind of ongoing due to that destabilization of those steep slopes when the trees burn. Culvert replacements, new gates on some closed roads, power line corridor work. I mean, the list goes on and on. There's going to be a lot happening in the next few years. This is a map that shows all of the current and proposed timber sales within the Riverside Fire on Forest Service land. And so some of these include, you know, already awarded contracts to private logging companies. So especially like this timber sale here, the Goat Mountain timber sale and the Grove timber sale, those were kind of in the process of being logged when the fire broke out. There's about 1,500 acres of those. And then there's quite a few future but not yet awarded contracts for logging that the Forest Service is probably going to be moving forward with, mostly up here in the North Clack area. And this project down here, the Whale timber sale, that was actually in the process of being planned and analyzed when the fire broke out, and that's now been totally canceled. But, you know, that said, other than Whale, there is likely going to be some logging reproposed in some of these other areas here post-fire. So we've got that to look out for. In terms of roads and road access, you know, the Riverside Fire contains about 250 miles of roads on Forest Service land. And this map shows some of that in the current closure area that exists. So this crosshatched area here, that's the actual burn perimeter, which is closed to all public access right now. And this pink shaded area here is closed to motorized access, but not non-motorized access. So for example, hiking in or riding your bike in there is fine. And then these red highlighted roads here are closed and pretty closely monitored by the Forest Service. And this is likely not going to change all that much until the spring in terms of the closure area. And this is an example of why there's, like I mentioned earlier, there's a lot of destabilized slopes in the area. So rock and tree fall is going to be happening all winter long and into the spring. And with that, we are already seeing a really massive tree removal effort by ODOT and the Forest Service, especially right along Highway 224, which is pictured here. So, tens of thousands of trees are being removed along these roads right now. And, the Forest Service and ODOT kind of have slightly different requirements for that and different protocols. But, on Forest Service land, the Forest Service handbook states that, for any road to be reopened to the public, there is a requirement that danger tree removal take place. This is just some more images from some of those trees that are being removed from right off the 224. And here's some more. This is actually from the 36 pit fire when they did some danger tree removal there. And there were definitely some areas where we went to where we noticed that some of the trees that they were taking were really, really far away from roads and trails. And we felt it was a little bit extending their reach. So this is definitely something that BARC is tracking since, like I mentioned before, we've got something like 250 miles of roads that are within that fire perimeter. That equates to potentially a lot of logging taking place. And so along with that kind of response, sometimes the fire suppression itself can have some pretty gnarly trade-offs. And this is an example that I'll bring up here. Well after the fire had stopped growing, the Forest Service decided to reopen a closed road that ran between two wilderness areas. Let me go back here and show you where this is. This is it here, the 4810 or the Abbott Road. It goes between the Roaring River Wilderness and the Salmon Huckleberry Wilderness. So it was miles away from fire activity, but the idea was that it could be used at some point as an indirect line if the winds picked back up and the fire started spreading. This area was really remote, and there were many trees that were cut down in the process of reopening this road, which, it had been effectively closed by a landslide, I think probably over 10 years ago. And since then had seen a lot of unauthorized encroachment by off-highway vehicles into the wilderness area. So it was a fairly problematic and kind of a dangerous road. And reopening this was done with emergency funding, and it's likely that this road is going to remain open now into the future. These are just some more images from that. This tree on the left that was cut down, it looks like, had already survived potentially multiple fires only to be cut down in this fire suppression effort. Is really a shame. And you can see here on the right, the road itself was left with some really deep ruts with this, and then we got this log deck here in the background. And yeah, I just wanted to end things here with these images of what's going on Port Blakely property, which is just to the west of the National Forest. This is industrial forest land right off the hill at Burn Road, just west of the South Fork of the Clackamas. And this is the kind of thing that we really do not want to see in the National Forest, which is post-fire clear cutting. And this is happening at a very large scale. If you go out and drive any of these roads, you can see it for yourself. And after these are clear cut, they're going to be then replanted densely to maximize that economic return. And that kind of follow-up activity is also what we really do not want to see happen on the National Forest, where these forests, they really do have the ability to, and already are, regenerating on their own in many places. So I think I'm going to hand it back over to Brenna.
Thanks, Michael. Hey, while I'm getting my screen back, there was a question in the chat that I couldn't answer about the edge of the fire where it kind of hit up with Beachy Creek. Do you want to talk about whether, like, how those two fires interacted and whether or not that magnified the intensity of the fire?
Yeah. So as far as I know, they didn't physically meet. There was a lot of talk about what would happen if they did end up meeting. I remember the incident command teams were talking a lot about, would that then become some kind of mega fire? But they didn't. I can't remember how many miles they got from within each other, but yeah, they didn't actually meet. Hopefully that answers the question.
Good, and you can look back in the chat also and see, and we can discuss that at the end. So I'm going to go into where do we go from here. First of all, thank you, Michael. That was super informative, and honestly, a little heartbreaking. And anyone who's been around me for any length of time knows that I'm generally very, very fire positive. I'm feeling emotional, but those are like some of my favorite places in the Clackamas, and that's the first time I've seen them all burned up. And I know they're going to be amazing, but it is change, right? And change is hard. And there is a sense of loss around it. There's a sense of loss of the place we knew, and the way that we loved it is going to be different. So if you're feeling that right now, I am totally there with you. I think, the amazing thing is that forests are so much older and vaster than we are, and change so much. But it can be hard to come to grips with that. And right now I'm feeling a little sad. And that said, I know that post-fire environments are some of the most beautiful biodiverse environments out there. And so they will be different, just, they'll be beautiful, just differently beautiful. Okay, a little emotional check-in. But I want to talk about, kind of scaling back up, like, where do we go from here, right? And I start with good old soon-to-be ex-President Trump, who made this statement in California after some of the massive, devastating fires they had. Both that climate change was just gonna get cooler, we just had to watch, and as he says, you got to clean your floors, you got to clean the forests. They're like so flammable. You touch them and it goes up. So President Trump's solution to all of this, like many of his solutions to things, was bad, but it has an enormous resonance in both industry and government. And unfortunately, even in the media, if you were following the media closely after the Labor Day fires, you might have seen that the timber industry beat anybody else to the punch while these fires were still burning. This op-ed in the Washington Post got printed on September 12th from a former state representative who was representing Timber Unity, blaming the fires not on climate change, not on winds, but on the fact that there has been poor timber management. And as it said, they've made it quite clear that the state's management failures with forests and rural lands would lead to catastrophic carbon releasing fire events. And for a lot of reasons, some of which I'll discuss now, some of which are just totally common sense, that's complete bull honky. So as we said at the beginning, as I said at the beginning, fires burn when the conditions are right. It's not because of the fuels. 9 times out of 10, or maybe even more, it's because of weather. But the industry over the past 10 years, as logging has got more and more disfavored socially, has shifted the perspective of them to being the saviors against fire. So, one of the last Spark events, we were talking with a creator of the Timber Wars, talking about that era in which logging really got under the public microscope as something that was bad for forests and was really disfavored publicly. And one of the brilliant ways that the industry shifted this was starting to present itself as the timber industry isn't the enemy, fire is the enemy, right? And that goes right back into the discussion we had about um, Smokey the Bear and the full suppression policy. And and also the fact that it's just scary, right? Fire is scary. The fire that Michael was talking about, I think you said it moved 17 miles in one day. Like that is a force that's terrifying. And people are right to be afraid of it. And so the timber industry drew on that fear and started doing a lot of propaganda around the fact that, like these two pieces of propaganda show that if you have logging, if you have active management, then you won't have fires. Well, of course, as Michael said, as they went through the Clackamas drainage, it didn't really matter what type of management that had, like practically, but that's really in the public mindset that it does. But people are starting though to debunk that myth. Luckily, there was a lot of good research, a lot of good media after this, discussing the fact that fires, especially the holiday fire, which got a lot of attention because it burned primarily in private lands that had been logged, burned just as bad, if not worse, than on lands that hadn't been logged. And often when it hit plantations, it just roared through because there was no structural diversity to slow the fire down in any way. So that myth that the way forward is more logging is luckily fading a little bit, and we have this extreme weather event to thank for it. And I'll just, move off this because I think if you're at a bark event, you probably know this, but I thought that this graph was also awfully telling, and I wanted to give you a minute to look at it. So we're still seeing, at least on the east side of the mountain, almost every single timber sale being justified by reducing fuels, so it will affect a future fire's behavior. Right on the west side, where the Riverside Fire came, that's less discussed because they're usually wind events. But on the east side, that is still the primary justification the Forest Service uses. So if you look at this chart, right, this is the forests in the west. And the top corner is the annual burned forest. Now, fuel treatments are in the bottom. Now, do you see the little top of that fifth tree in that has that little tiny bit of fire on it? That is the place where fuel treatments and fire intersected. Of all the fires and all the fuel treatments and all the forests, only 1% of fuel treatments happen to encounter wildfire each year. That's just a little example of when we're talking about fire, we cannot fixate on fuels. We just can't think of how do we manipulate the fuels to stop something like Riverside from happening again, because we just can't. And even if we could, the chances of that actually working are super limited. Now, pre-fire logging is something that is really, put out there. And as Michael mentioned, post-fire salvage logging is seen as one of the other solutions to fire. We are, fingers crossed, really hoping that the Forest Service sticks with what it's saying now, that it is not planning large-scale salvage logging in the Riverside area. Of course, that doesn't mean there aren't going to be any trees down. As Michael said, they're doing hazard tree removal along roads. And as you all know, there's a massive network of roads inside Mountain Hood National Forest. And they are planning to log as far as we know, all the roads that are open to the public at any time during the year. So because of that vast road network, there will be more logging to have the roads safe for travel. And we understand that that's necessary on the well-traveled roads, but it definitely begs a question of why it's needed on roads that have very little traffic, and whether or not it would make more sense just to close those roads rather than do things like reopen the Abbott Road that had been closed for a long time. I'll just mention there probably will be some salvage logging that's proposed for the White River Fire, which happened on the east side of Mount Hood, but we were we're honestly quite worried that there would be a large scale project on Riverside, and it doesn't look like that's going to happen. And in part, I'd like to say that's because of the fierce advocacy of people like you. The Forest Service knows it would have a fight on its hands if it did that. And I just don't think they have the capacity to take that fight on. So thank you, Barkers, for helping the Forest Service not do something stupid. Okay, here's the positive thing. Where do we go from here, right? These fires have happened before. They are going to continue happening. And I wanted to focus this last little bit on that shift from thinking about fires as a forest problem, as a tree problem, the way it's been branded for so long, to thinking about it in terms of a community issue and honestly a public health issue. And there are lots of things that we can do that we can pre-plan for the fires that we know are going to become next. You know, I have really good friends who live in New Orleans. And we had a long talk about fires while they were happening here. They called to check in on me, and I'm like, this is like what I do for you when there's hurricanes. And we talked about how in New Orleans, no one is out there thinking that they can put out the hurricane, right? They're not out there with their leaf blowers trying to blow the hurricane back, or with their they just don't. They recognize what they need to do is prepare for the hurricane that is going to come. And we need to have a shift of mentality to think of these fires as weather events, or as Michael put it, as wind events with a fire component that we are not going to put out. So how do we prepare, right? So one of the first things, and this is in Southern Oregon, but we need to be mindful of this up here too, is thinking about where we're actually building houses. Because we're building out farther and farther from urban areas. That said, there are areas, like there are towns that burned down that were not because of forests at all, like Talent and Phoenix, right? Or even the towns that burned down in the Santiam Canyon were not necessarily because of forest fires, but because they were having major electrical wires down. That said, it still matters where we put houses, and we need to think about it. But perhaps the thing that matters even more as than where we put them is, oops, it's supposed to be how we build them. That must be the next slide. So I'll get back to the smoke. How we build them. You know, Michael showed you that picture of a whole bunch of green trees with a burned house in the middle. And I remember looking at a lot of pictures like that in Paradise, California, when that town burned. The trees were fine, but the houses were all gone. And it's because once the ember cast happens, the fire, and the first house burns, the fires start spreading laterally between houses. And so one of the things that we need to think about is how to make those homes more resilient to fires. And people know how to do this. There are labs that burn down houses, and you can watch videos of them, and they're super cool. They know exactly what we can do to improve building codes, to create houses that are much, much more flame resistant. The impasse is that the building industry doesn't want to change those building codes. And that's something that's being looked at a state by state level, and definitely a place where Oregon could do better. And I want to go back, though, also to talk about smoke, because we all lived through that horrible, horrible 2 weeks of smoke. And there are some people for whom that became a truly life-threatening issue. You know, I have a housemate that has severe asthma, and he tried to escape the smoke, and he couldn't. He drove every direction and couldn't get out of it. And it's for people like him and people with other respiratory conditions that we need to invest in public health smoke shelters, in good air filters for the more vulnerable populations. Like this year with the pandemic, we've talked a lot about what it looks like to have pre-existing conditions and vulnerabilities that make you, have a lot harder issue with whatever's going on. And if we shifted to a mindset of preparing for fire, we could think who are our most vulnerable populations and how do we help them prepare for smoke? That's another forward thinking place that we'd like to go. Let me move one more. Oh yeah. Also, there are steps that people can take. it doesn't mean that a fire won't get you, but it's highly likely that you can decrease the ability of a fire to come in to your home. And as we're looking towards a future with more fires, thinking about home hardening and home safety and structural safety is one of the main things. This guy, Dr. Jack Cohen, who's quoted in this slide, he's the one who really likes to burn down houses. And if you are curious about the issue of home flammability versus forests, check out his work because he makes it very, very clear that the focus should not be on backcountry thinning or logging, but rather home ignitions and how we can change those. And then finally, there are things that we can do in terms of fire management that would change things. So how do we learn to live with fires, even really big, scary wind-driven fires like Riverside? One of the first is generally ending the practice of full fire suppression for all ignitions, right? With Riverside, they knew they couldn't put it out. They knew that they would have to wait for the weather to change, right? But honestly, that's true with most fires. It's not firefighting that puts them out, it's weather. And the damage that is done by trying to put it out and the millions of dollars, like the White River fire on the east side was a low severity fire in an area that everyone agreed needed to burn. And they spent millions and millions and millions of dollars trying to put it out. Millions of dollars that could have gone to other things that actually made the forest better and made the communities better. So that's something that BARC has been working on for years, is to amend the forest plan to get rid of the forest plan's requirement for full suppression of every ignition. And that would allow the use of wildland fire, naturally lit fires that were managed to burn under the right conditions, or more prescribed fires that would also help return fire on the landscape where it has been missing, most notably on the east side of the mountain. Also working with traditional ecological land stewards. I want to bring us back to one of the places I began, was with indigenous burning practices. The person pictured here is Margot Robbins of the Yurok tribe, and she works doing cultural fire and bringing it back to the Yurok reservation. She's also just a fantastic, funny, brilliant person who I've gotten to know a little bit during this work. And down in Northern California, the Yurok and the Hupa and the Karuk are all working together along the Klamath River to bring indigenous fire practices back. On Warm Springs Reservation that borders Mount Hood National Forest, many of the tribal members are also bringing fire back and lighting more intentional fires. That is something we need to learn from and learn with and help support, because, you know, fire might destroy homes and be scary, but it does rejuvenate the forests. And it's going to be with us, you know, whether we like it or not, because of climate change. We're going to be having more, probably more frequent fires. We're back in that hot, dry climactic period. And, you know, we need to remember that, you know, the forest loves us. And I wanted to end with this picture. I love it. It's just been a hard year, right? We're coming into the end of 2020, and it's been a rough go. And those fires made a hard year even harder. And here's my kid wanting to check out this picture of a heart. And I just want us to remember, like, the forest still has our backs and we still have it. Like, we're all in this together. We've all gone through hard times. We've been part of exciting uprisings. We've been part of devastating pandemics. We've been part of scary fires. And none of that's actually going to go away. All of the things that happened in 2020 are with us. They are part of our history now and going to be influencing the future. But we're in this together. And I'm really glad that you all are here and part of BARC. And I want to invite you, before I forget, when we go into questions, I might completely forget. I want to invite you to be part of the next BARC event, which is on Thursday. So you get like one night break. We want you to come back with us because we're talking specifically about the future of Mount Hood National Forest and about changing the forest plan to incorporate some of these elements, like a better sense on fire, like the changing climate, into the forest plan. So we're having our People's Forest Forum on Thursday from 7 to 9. And we really invite all of you to come back and learn about how we can help the Forest Service shift its management and update the 1990 plan to reflect the current reality that we're all in. So with that, I'll shush. I've noticed the chat has been active and can find out if there's questions for me or for Michael or any thoughts that you all might have. We've got about 10 to 15 minutes left where we can talk about all of this.
First of all, happy holidays to each of you and the people that are close to you. And thank you all for the work you do for the forests. Just some reflections and perspective. My first summer doing firefighting was 1973 on the Clackamas River. And at that time, without wind events, a large fire was 25,000 acres. And so we see that kind of acreage burned in an afternoon now in these big events. Let's see what else. ODOT actually did a really reasonable job, in my estimation, along Highway 84 in the Eagle Creek burn. They didn't take out everything. And you can still see that if you drive the highway now. They skipped areas of green live trees and they took down the ones that were really hazardous. So hopefully they'll do that on the Clackamas. It would be great if that would encourage them to do it. Yeah, fireproofing, home ignition, very important. And another thing I think that you might have mentioned, Brenna, is when do we want our smoke? Do we want it in huge quantities in September, or are we willing to take it at some other times of the year when prescribed fire could potentially be used to reintroduce fire in areas where it's needed? And I think, there are probably some changes in DEQ, air quality regulations, and some other things around that. My own preference would be I'd have smoke in little doses over the spring and early summer when a rain event might clear the air, rather than a 2-week intense period like we had. So I'll be quiet.
Thanks, Russ. I think we can't always pick when we want our smoke, because sometimes those large weather events will happen. But you are correct, especially in areas where fire has been excluded. People are really working on doing prescribed fire to reset the ecosystem so that when a fire comes through, it'll burn with a just more natural process than it would otherwise. And we're actually working hand in hand with the Forest Service on the east side to get more prescribed fire down on the ground there, which is a fun thing to be working with them for a change. Are there other thoughts or questions? And Michael, also feel free to chime on in.
There were a few questions in the chat. Ben asked how the old growth in the area was affected. Ben, was there a specific area you were talking about, or just the Riverside Fire in general?
I will say that we haven't been able to really get into the Riverside Fire area yet. There have been the bear reports. I know Michael's going to get to do a flyover, but we honestly don't know how some of the old growth areas are. Like, I'm particularly interested in all that beautiful old growth along the Riverside Trail. Like, how did that come through? The whole area has been closed. And so aside from just being on the edges of the forest and seeing it, we don't know yet. And so that'll be seen when we get in the forest more, when they open it back up, and hopefully some from the flyover.
Other questions. Aaron asked if there's any projection on when fire will hit outer Portland, aka how concerned Portlanders should be about keeping shrubs and trees away from siding and roof.
I mean, that's a fantastic question. If the wind would have kept blowing, it could have. I live in outer Southwest Portland, and we were on level 1 evacuation, and it was scary, right? It was wholly a function of weather And because the wind stopped, it didn't get into Portland, but it could. It absolutely could. And if we get other, with the drought increasing, if we get other dry days, like it doesn't take a forest fire to set something like this off. Like look at Talent in Phoenix, right? Those towns were substantially incinerated. No trees involved. And so when it's really hot, really dry, and really windy, if we got an urban fire going in Portland, it would be trouble. And so, the things that people really talk about are metal roofs, are cleaning your gutters, are checking your air ducts to make sure you don't get embers down your air ducts, and to not having vegetation touch your houses in urban areas. Your home insurance also requires that. If you're tracking it, you can't actually have like vegetation growing up the side of your house, which I know I've got a really great grapevine growing up on the side of my house, and I know that that's a problem. But I don't think we can, be in this mindset, again, that Pacific decadal oscillation mindset of we're safe, fires are a thing that we can control. That's how we've been raised. That's how our, like either we or our parents were raised in that mindset. And that's what we have come to expect. But we can no longer expect that. So call me, I don't want to be a doomsdayist, but I want us to be like real that with climate change, fire is here to stay more.
I was going to say, and this is also sort of in response to the fuel breaks question. I saw a question down there about fuel breaks, which, the Mount Hood National Forest has proposed and implemented some fuel breaks. But, there's certain types of fires where things like fuel breaks and kind of diversifying the landscape work, for those kind of like small, moderate, not wind events like fire events, but for these large, infrequent wind events with fire that we're talking about on the west side, it really requires a different kind of response. You have to, it's important to think about fire-wise activities and, work around the home and fuels reduction near infrastructure and all of this stuff. But I think it's also really important on the west side here to kind of how Brenna alluded to, like treating this a little bit more like a subduction zone, like a earthquake or a hurricane. There, along with the fire-wise stuff, there also needs to be a lot of focus on prompt detection and, preparing the infrastructure and really giving the resources to people that they need so they can be prepared to evacuate when they need to. I know that those resources just weren't there for a lot of communities, unfortunately, that were hit by, especially like the Beachy Creek and the Lion's Head fires. And, it's really important if you live near some of these fire-prone areas to have your evacuation routes identified, so you can go when you need to. So preparing for these large wind-driven events, there's just different things, different things that work or that don't work compared to those kind of more small, moderate.
Hey,
And
Michael.
the old growth, yep.
I was going to say there's also a question in the chat about beaver activity in Riverside. You want to talk about all the equipment that we can't get to?
Yeah, so we were, let's see, I'm trying to get to this question, see what it says exactly. Beaver activity patterns. Yeah, so we were doing a lot of monitoring of beaver populations and of, wetland conditions in terms of hydrology before the fire happened. We were actually able to install, I think, maybe about 10 to a dozen water table monitoring probes in a bunch of different areas in the Clackamas. And so we haven't been able to get to those or get to any of our sites. However, if you do look at where the fire ended up burning, severely versus, more moderate or not at all, a lot of those wetland sites look like they were largely spared. And I would be willing to bet that are going to remain green. And that's actually something that we're looking into over the course of the next year through things like aerial imagery and satellite imagery to sort of try to get a sense of, you know, before and after, what were some of the effects on some of those beaver maintained wetlands, and how did those areas provide a refugia for, you know, not just beavers, but other wildlife as well. And, you know, there's been some work done in other places to suggest that these wetland maintained sites really serve a critical role for providing that fire refugia. And so stay tuned for that effort in the coming year. I'm really excited to see how some of those areas fared and whether or not there's still beavers there.
So the reason, this is Caitlin Lovell, I asked that question is because I actually own a 5-acre beaver pond that at the edge of the fire. And I am convinced that that pond prevented the fire from spreading down to my property. Port Blakely is my neighbor. The fire jumped the fire line, like all of the worst case scenario events. It's, you know, when you look at that claw of the Riverside Fire as it approaches 211, there's that random 500-acre spot that was effectively my backyard. And they used my house and my driveway and my forest road as the access point to fight that fire. But on my property, I have a 5-acre beaver pond, and we've been encouraging the beavers. So in addition to the hydrology and the hyporheic flow and the lovely wet soils that I had still in September and October, I am also interested in how it potentially changed the atmospheric conditions and created, you know, when you stood at my house at the end of my driveway next to the beaver pond, it was almost as if there was an inversion and the wind stopped. And for 2 days, I mean, the first day, Monday, we had significant winds, but Tuesday, when it was really getting close to our house, there were no winds on my property. And I really attribute that to the beaver pond. So that's something that, you know, people haven't been looking into. They're really looking into the hydrology of it. But I also think that it has something to do with the microclimate as well.
That's amazing.
That's super awesome. We've heard of that happening in other places, like in the Methow Valley. There were huge fires and they went up to where the beavers had ponds and none of it was burned. So we might be following up with you for beavers are great testimonials, because that's exactly the kind of information that we're using to try and get more support for beaver on Mount Hood National Forest.
Yeah, and I know there's a lot of researchers right now that are really interested in looking at the hydrology pre and post fire in you know, not just the Riverside Fire, but all the Labor Day fires, and we might be working with some of them. And I know that, you know, looking at some of those microclimate effects is something that they're interested in. So yeah, well, let's stay in touch for sure. This is it's an exciting sort of like emerging area of learning that, yeah, we're all really excited about.
Well, thank you, everyone. We're at time, and I know we didn't get to every question in the chat, but we really appreciate you being here, learning about this, talking to your people about it, and, you know, really just being mindful, like, the things are changing here and we need to adapt, learn from this experience. So hopefully the next time the fires come around, we'll be much more prepared.
Thanks so much, everyone, and we'll see you again soon.